We are recording. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for joining us. I know that there is probably a lot that you could be doing right at this moment. There's a lot of Zoom meetings competing for your attention, and I am so pleased and honored that you chose to spend this time with us today. And I want to introduce our guests, and we'll give the mic over to them in just a second. But just to say hello, we've got Hayley Gillooly. Did I pronounce that right?
Indeed, you did.
Awesome. Calling from Los Angeles. And Suhaila is also going to be talking with us today. Suhaila, how do I pronounce your last name?
It's Seacon.
Seacand. Okay, cool. And Mark, I'm going to hand the mic over to Mark real quick to give us just a brief little intro on what Climate Designers is about, and then we will get started on today's content.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thanks again for those who are joining. We appreciate you spending some time with us. Sarah and I co-founded Climate Designers about 14 months ago, I believe. And it was just a simple idea to see if there are other creatives who are wanting to take climate action in the work that they do. And holy crap, turns out that there are a lot of other people who have the same interest. And so we started with a simple landing page and an email sign up to figure out if there was even an idea there. And what you see now is an evolution of Climate Designers over the course of 14 or so months with the help of a ton of our amazing volunteers. We have chapters all over the globe. We do virtual events like this. We have a podcast. We have a whole resource for design educators. If you are a design educator out there, please reach out to me. My email is in my little Zoom name. Sarah and I teach part-time at California College of the Arts. Design education is a passion of ours, and we want to incorporate a lot of what it is that we're doing in design ed, get them while they're young, right? And there's a lot of other amazing things that we're doing. If you are new to Climate Designers, definitely poke around the website, and you would have had to log in to Mighty Network, which is our online community, and say hi. It's a very friendly, cool community full of supportive folks. And yeah, thanks again for coming, and hand it back over to you, Sarah.
Awesome. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If at any time during this event you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. We're going to do about 20 minutes of just setting the context. And then after that 20 or 30 minutes, we will have time to get to questions that are in the chat, but just feel free to throw them in there when you think of them to mark your place. And we will get to them later. So this event is called What is Next? Speaking of climate policy under new US leadership. So now that we have the US election is all settled, we want to learn what in the heck is actually going to happen as far as climate action goes. A lot of us have been waiting for a while, very anxiously, to get moving on some impactful climate action, and we definitely need government and policy to really make that happen. And we have with us Hayley Gillooly, like I mentioned, who speaks the insider language of climate policy as an international policy negotiator. And we're really, really excited and lucky to learn from her. And then hopefully uh, figure out some ways that we as designers can help move the bar as far as climate action and climate impact goes. So after Hayley gives you some content on who she is and her background and what kinds of questions she can ask and helps us learn and all of that stuff, Suhaila is here to tell us about the climate policy group that she's heading up inside of Climate Designers, which started as just a, hey, I want to learn more about climate policy. So we're really excited to get some ideas from her about what has been happening so far inside the community from people who are excited about climate policy. And then with Hayley and all of our powers combined, I think maybe we can come up with some new and impactful ways to make some climate impact on climate policy. So with all of that said, I will go ahead and hand the mic over to Hayley to get us started.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here talking to you all. I will say I'm also a little bit intimidated to have put together a slide deck in a community of designers. So when you're viewing my slides, I just beg that you will remind yourselves that I come from a background of writing policy memos where we're a little bit light on the nice graphics. But yeah, so like Sarah was saying, I come from the climate policy world, and essentially my background is working as a climate diplomat. So I spent most of the past 4 years working for the US State Department, where I was a climate change negotiator for a tiny bit under Obama and for the most part under Trump. Definitely have some things to say to you all about that. Um, when Sarah and Mark and I met virtually a few months ago this year, one of the things we started talking about was that this climate designers community is really interested in having concrete direct impacts. And one of the things we started talking about is how sometimes it feels like there's a disconnect between, the policy world and what's going on either in Washington or in state houses, and what maybe people who are interested in care and have talents they want to share actually know about. So we started this kind of brainstorming around, well, what could we do to maybe share some information with the climate designers community? Maybe I can share about things that I've worked on, what I've seen in government, and especially since we're at this really interesting inflection point with a new president coming in who's actually making climate change a priority. What are we looking at? So what I was thinking to do today is try to keep my remarks pretty high level. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I actually can start sharing my info with you all. So yeah, here's what I figured I'd do today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'll focus a bit on what it was like working on climate change at the State Department. This is my example of what does the government actually do around climate? How does it work? Based on that, I'll just go real high level on what President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have said they're going to do around climate, and share some ideas around what that might mean for all of us and what we can be looking out for. And definitely, I'm thinking of this as your conversation. So I want to take the conversation wherever you guys want to go. I'm most equipped to talk with you all about international policy, domestic policy at sort of the federal level, climate change negotiations, what it's like working with other countries. But we'll definitely do my best to talk about anything that you guys have questions about. So with that, a little bit about me. I realize this slide is basically outdoors, animals, and Obama. So I have always been really interested in the environment and the outdoors. When I was a little kid, those of you growing up in the 90s may remember the kind of craze around saving the rainforest that sort of rose to national attention. I spent a lot of time in elementary school selling these really dated oversized t-shirts that said, save the iguana, save the this, save the that. So I felt very interested in the outdoors and what was going on around me from a young age. I've ended up spending most of the last 10 years in Washington, D.C., but I actually grew up across the country in California. When I finished college at UC Santa Barbara, I had no idea what to do. All I knew is that I didn't want to work in a boring office pushing paper around. So what I ended up doing was getting a job at an environmental nonprofit in Washington, D.C., where I sat in an office building and pushed paper around. So that was not necessarily what I had expected, but this is the photo on the right with the shirt with Obama. The organization I worked for was an environmental advocacy group called the League of Conservation Voters. And for me, as a Southern California girl who had not really focused much on policy or politics outside my little world, this was my first exposure to national policy, national politics. The organization itself focuses on something called a cycle of accountability. So working to elect good members of Congress who in their case support the environment and then also working to hold those people accountable. So worked in Washington, D.C., lobbied on the Hill to members of Congress, worked on policy, and unfortunately pushed a lot of paper around. After that, I felt like I wanted some more on the ground experience. I wanted to get out of my sort of city bubble. So I worked as a grassroots organizer, which is where the photo in the middle comes from, on a national campaign to work to build a more sustainable US food system. And that job was fascinating. It took me all over the US to a number of different states, working with everyone from governor's offices to state and city public health departments to farmers market associations to actual farmers to universities to community activists who are all trying to like work on the ground to work for more sustainable agriculture, for farm worker rights, for greater nutrition in underserved communities. So had a lot of fascinating experiences there. I ended up going to grad school. I got a master's in public policy from Harvard, from the Kennedy School. And there were 2 or maybe 3 things that I focused on in graduate school. One was I wanted to work more internationally. Climate change is such an international issue that I felt like I wanted to go broader. The second thing is I really wanted to focus on climate change specifically because I was seeing the really deadly impacts of it and felt from my time in Washington that things weren't happening fast enough. And I also got really interested in negotiations and sort of how do you influence people and groups? How do you get things done? How do you find common ground when you're working with people or organizations where you don't see eye to eye? After grad school, that's basically what I did. I moved into the international sphere. I worked for a time in Cambodia for an organization that works with smallholder farmers who were being impacted by changing climate conditions and needed to find new growing techniques and new crops. And that was really fascinating on the ground experience. I then worked at the World Bank, which is the photo on the right, and in Washington, D.C., which is an international development bank. Right around this time, it was 2016. Those of you who have followed some about the Paris Agreement might know that it recently turned 5 years old. The Paris Agreement was agreed to December 12th, 2015. So 2016 was all about what do we do with the Paris Agreement? How do we use this as an international device to hold countries accountable for their emissions and to hold countries accountable for what they're saying they're going to do to reduce emissions. So I was doing some work around that at the World Bank. And around that time was when I got hired to work at the State Department in their climate change office. The only thing is that there's a big thing that happened in 2016, and that was the US election in November. So I was in a really interesting position of starting at the State Department to work as a climate change diplomat in literally the last week of the Obama administration before transitioning into Trump. And that experience, I think, has really shaped how I'm thinking about climate work, how I think about how we can have impact, and how I'm looking at what's going on with a Biden administration now. And first, just a quick note, if you haven't ever worked in government before, it's incredibly large. It's often confusing to know what happens when, but there's a really general distinction. Domestic climate change actions, so things like headlines about Trump rolling back environmental regulations, things like that, those tend to happen at the Environmental Protection Agency, maybe the Department of the Interior, with the White House having final say. All international climate change work is done out of the State Department. So under the Obama administration, the office that I worked for was the team that negotiated the Paris Agreement for the US. So that's kind of a basic distinction in terms of what I'm talking about here. So climate change at state, the State Department is the oldest US cabinet level agency. It was started way back. It's basically, if you've ever heard of the term soft power, the State Department does soft power. They do action on foreign policy through diplomacy, advocacy, and assistance. And the office that I worked for, the climate change bureau is responsible for implementing and managing US policy on climate and also doing negotiations. I would say here that probably the single most significant thing that happened to me while I was at the State Department was working there in the era of Trump, and how we had to rethink our operations in order to work under a Trump administration. And that's something that I think is really interesting to keep in mind under Biden now, which is that who the president is has a massive impact, not only on who sits in the White House, but who sits in all federal agencies, what their policy priorities are, how much money they have, what money they have to spend, whether they can hire people. So just like when I was in the State Department, a lot of what we were working on was learning to work under a much smaller budget, work under a hiring freeze for most of the time that I was there, and really have work to have different priorities to advocate for. So the team that I worked on were all predated the Trump administration. And the goal is sort of a public servant or a civil servant is really continuity. You have to carry out the priorities of the administration in power, but especially in something like climate change and these negotiations, including the Paris Agreement, it's about how do you maintain diplomatic ties and relationships, and how do you maintain agreements that are going to last past the current person in power. So under a Trump administration, what that looked like was still surprisingly doing a lot of what's called climate diplomacy. So our office stayed incredibly active in international negotiations. And when people would ask, well, that's surprising to me, I thought, the president isn't making climate a priority, doesn't believe in it. Why is the US going to negotiations? And simply enough, the answer is the rest of the world cares about climate change, regardless of whether this administration does or not. So all of these international forums, from regulating international shipping, which is what the photo on the left is. I was a negotiator to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping industry, to civil aviation, to you guys have probably heard of, many of you, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. That's what the Paris Agreement was negotiated under. That's the photo on the right. The US, for the entire time that I was with the government, was still a party to the Paris Agreement, even though the president had said we were leaving. So we were in this really weird position of essentially having announced that we were going to leave, but not having done so yet. The analogy that I love for that, I think it came out of the New York Times, and it said, like a spouse that has announced that they are seeking a divorce but won't move out of the house. The United States has said that they're withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but they can't actually withdraw for 4 years. So it was this really bizarre experience of, you have top level policy guidance from the White House, but we also had guidance from the White House to say, advocate for US interests, get the best deals possible on these rules for the Paris Agreement, which is all about countries reporting on their emissions and also reporting on their progress to reducing emissions. We had the instructions, even though we had announced we were leaving, to make these strong rules so that there aren't loopholes, so that there isn't double counting, so that you don't have major emitters. And China and Brazil and India are some of the worst offenders who will put forward numbers that aren't accurate or won't cite their sources. So climate diplomacy continued very much, even though at a top level, the US had announced that it was drawing back. And I think one lesson that I have there that I took away from that is policy is much, much bigger than any one president, even though one president can have a very big impact. So like I said, multilateral negotiations continued. A number of you, since you follow climate issues, may have heard of, the COPs, the COP meetings. That stands for Conference of the Party. COP21 in 2015 is what the Paris Agreement was negotiated under. COP25 was held in Madrid last year. The photo on the left is the US negotiating team at COP24, which was in Katowice, Poland, where we finished negotiating what's called the Paris Agreement Rulebook, and those were called the most important negotiation since the Paris Agreement. So a really interesting experience of working really closely with people from other countries, building relationships, building strong trust relationships, even in a setting where, you know, the house was on fire in terms of actual US policy guidance on climate. And this is just a couple other negotiation photos. These come from, I believe, the G20, which is basically 20 of the largest economies in the world that get together and theoretically set the tone for economic assistance, climate assistance, etc. I think all of that sets us up now for Biden won, now what? I won't go into a ton of detail on this, but if people have specific questions, I'm definitely happy to talk about this. But what I just had experienced for the past 4 years as a climate diplomat under an administration that to put it diplomatically, did not prioritize climate change. One of the things I learned was the government is huge. It's a massive system. You can make progress even when the policy signals are not clear or are not where you want them to be. And like I said before, also who the president is has a huge impact, which means that under Biden, there is so much potential for him and his administration to make a difference in terms of more funding, where funding goes, personnel decisions on who gets appointed and who gets hired, what the strategic priorities are, what research is done, what partnerships. This is such an impactful moment for this issue. And I would say for anyone and for everyone on this call who cares about the issue, it's a really, really good time to be a climate advocate. A couple overarching points, and I think sometimes this gets lost in the chatter. Biden's plan to tackle climate change is actually the most aggressive and ambitious of any major US party candidate ever. So what that means is any Republican or Democrat who has actually been nominated by their party to run for president, this is the most ambitious plan. And it's an interesting point because Biden is often and not incorrectly cast as more of a moderate, more of a centrist, and he is. But I think this is a testament both to Biden and his administration being pulled somewhat to the left in order to bring stronger climate progressives on board. And it's also a testament to the fact that people care about climate change as a mainstream issue in a way that they have never done before, especially in the US. When I started doing this work in 2008, climate change was still largely a fringe issue. And this gets back to the opportunity we have, which is if enacted, Biden's climate plan would be the most progressive climate strategy the US has ever had. But it's those two words, if enacted, are doing a lot of work here because there's a lot of if writing on this. And I think this gets into what we'll be talking about more, which is like, what can we all do? Because it's not just up to one person on all of this. So I'm going to keep this high level, but just so you guys can have some information to take a look at. Biden's climate policy is quite broad. It's available online if you're interested. The kind of couple top level points are, he says that the US will have carbon-free electricity production by 2035. This is a big deal because the electricity sector is responsible for about 30% of the US's emissions. Most of that comes from coal and natural gas. So actually getting that sector carbon-free impacts about a third of the US's emissions. He's also committed to the US reaching net zero emissions by 2050. This is the so-called mid-century decarbonization strategy that's a really big deal in international conversations. He wants to invest $2 trillion over 4 years to shift the US from fossil fuels, and he wants to rejoin the Paris Agreement. On the right, you'll see some more detailed information, which I won't get into, but it shows, depending on things that you are interested in. I was talking with my brother about this the other day, and he was saying he's a brand strategist in Los Angeles, and he was saying, oh, I've done work around electric vehicles before. This is really interesting that Biden wants to invest in EV manufacturing and charging. That's very interesting. My brother's not someone who considers himself like, oh, I work on climate change. So it's really interesting, I think, to get ideas going about what the implications could be. Just briefly, the point that the devil is very much in the details. I think the couple points here are international and domestic issues are really linked. Biden wants to do these things internationally, but the key to his credibility on the international stage is going to be what his domestic policies on cutting carbon are. So there's a lot riding on this. There's also, this is the if enacted point, there's a lot that Biden can do on his own and that he said he's going to do. So in terms of executive actions, the president can unilaterally rejoin the Paris Agreement. Biden said he'll do that on day one, on January 21st. He can undo Trump's environmental rollbacks. I was checking before we talked today. At the current count, the Trump administration has rolled back 84 major environmental regulations, and there are 20 in progress. This is everything from air pollution and emissions, drilling and extraction, infrastructure, water pollution, and toxic substances. So there's a lot that Biden can do to sort of undo the damage of the Trump administration. But one point is that there's a lot he can't do. For example, Biden's $2 trillion commitment, he's basically not going to be able to do that unless he has Congress on his side, because Congress are the people who hold the purse strings. So a lot is going to be riding on who controls the Senate specifically. And that gets at the last point I wanted to make, which is just a couple things for folks to watch out for in the coming months. One is Biden's first 100 days. There's always a focus on what a president does in the 100 days. What can they say? So like I was saying, look for him to rejoin the Paris Agreement, look for environmental rollbacks to be put back in place, things like Obama's Clean Power Plan, stronger vehicle standards. Also look for the results of the Georgia Senate races. As many of you probably know, right now, control of the Senate is up in the air. If Republicans maintain control of the Senate, Biden's ability to act and act fast, it won't be impossible, but it's going to be hugely constricted, because he essentially, if passed as president, is not really going to be able to work very well with Republicans in the Senate, because they have tended to be extremely obstructionist. So what happens with the Senate races in January will be huge. I'd also say watch out for COVID-19 recovery plans. One of Biden's big things he said is the environment and the economy are linked. So an economic recovery needs to include an environmental recovery. And the last thing I'd mention is look out for COP26, which will be happening. These are related to the Paris Agreement in November of next year. This year was the first time ever there was not a COP because of the pandemic. So there's even more focus on countries feeling like they need to catch up on the ambition of the Paris Agreement, because people sort of feel like this was a wasted year due to the pandemic. So especially now that the US will re-enter the Paris Agreement in January, there's going to be a huge focus on what countries can get done at these negotiations, but also how activists can influence. So groups like Greta Thunberg's, who go to the COPs every year for these major student demonstrations, there's room for not just government workers, but activists who care. And I think that's a good place to stop now, since I think where we want to go next is hearing from Suhaila and then brainstorming about, well, how can we actually plug in different ways? So I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hayley. That was fantastic and super fascinating. I had no idea, just as an aside, while Suhaila's getting her slides ready, I had no idea that you came at this, like many of us, came at climate awareness in part through food security concerns and sustainable food practices. That's sort of my entry point as well. And I've heard the same from other climate designers. It's awesome. Yeah, really great stuff. So for everyone who entered a little bit late, feel free to add your questions for Hayley or Suhaila or for the group into the chat, and we will get to them after we set context here. So just a few more minutes. All right, Suhaila, take it away.
Hi, everyone. we're going to test out the captioning on Google Slides. So apologies, but it doesn't really work. Hi, everyone. I'm Hayley Gillooly. I am a climate designer, and I know that we have a few other people in this group that are also in climate design as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Vote for Climate, which is a social campaign for climate action that we started in the climate design group. And sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so Vote for Climate, as I said, is a social campaign for climate action. What that means is that we present climate action and climate policy in a simple manner, in simplified ways. We have a resource hub on climatedesigners.org/vote that really helps aggregate information and resources together as a place for people to continue researching on their own, but also to have all the graphics in one area. We do this by, our goal is to mobilize young voters based on proven information by harnessing the power of social media. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we are trying to make climate policy, which, as you just learned about with Hayley, it's quite complicated and really, like, there's a lot that goes into it. So we're trying to make that more accessible to an average American, to an average person, whether you're in the States or anywhere else. Originally, this started to mobilize voters for the 2020 general election in November. And we realized that, it really doesn't need to stop there, that mobilizing young voters can also mean mobilizing someone who's 16, who's planning on voting in 2 years. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean when you're mobilizing someone to think about it on a local level? What is the role of city council in that sense, right? Like, how do you get involved in local action? And really trying to do that by presenting these piggybacking off of policy that people like Hayley will create and help develop and help push out, and making that more accessible to someone like you and me, right? So as I said, we make it relatable, accessible, meaningful, and we're now working on equity centered. What that means is, for equity centered, is that we're trying to incorporate environmental justice and have that conversation. Whether a policy incorporates environmental justice in the actual text, or if that's something that we have to question, and like, why is environmental justice there or not there? Who is at the table, and what really is being considered? Excuse me for my crazy thoughts right now. Totally off topic. Yeah. So instead of talking at you, I'm just going to walk you through a couple of our posts. This is Catriel, who made this, created the graphics with the help of Eric Benson, and I think Catriel is on this call. And this is for air pollution and talking about some of the pieces of the Clean Air Act. This specific regulation is the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, called the MATS. And it was a regulation which reduced emissions from greenhouse gases. And unfortunately, Trump rolled back this regulation specifically. It was signed by Obama in 2012, and it included co-benefits of other air pollution besides just mercury. Between 2016 and April 2020, which is for the duration that it was adopted and in place, mercury emissions from coal plants had reduced by 80%. That's a lot in just 4 years. But in April 2020, the Trump administration modified the legislation and eliminated the co-benefits from the regulation, which basically created a loophole and allows now industry to not clean up pollution that would be too costly to clean. I think that was taken from the New York Times. So some of those co-benefits include lead, chromium-6, benzene, arsenic, and a lot of other really toxic chemicals. And they are now unregulated under not protected anymore under the math. Excuse me. So basically what that means is that there's more prenatal damages and defects, and some people have correlated miscarriage as well as increased in autism rates with a rise in mercury levels. There's also unregulated chromium-6. If you have heard of Aaron Berkowitz, that's where you've heard of this toxin before. It also means that in the original MATs, they saved 11,000 lives, 130,000 asthma attacks, 4,700 heart attacks, and 540,000 or more days of work. Now that the original MATs has been rolled back in these ways, these lives and these risks are now back at play, which is really sad. So what we're asking with Vote for Climate is also to mobilize and demand action and create action around that. So we would like the US to reinstate MATs and its co-beneficiaries, employ stricter air standards and higher expectations from industry, as well as look at environmental justice. So that's a sample of one of the posts that we have out there. I'm going to walk through a few more super quick and then kind of loop it back. So this post is created by Eric Benson and talks about fossil fuel subsidies. So the average American would save $2,530 per year if the US eliminated all fossil fuel subsidies. We talk about what a subsidy is, which is that they are funded through taxpayers. And the idea is that a subsidy will actually reduce the price of the product or the item or the service once it hits the consumer. So if there was no subsidies and no fossil fuel subsidies, the gas prices would go up around 10 cents a barrel. That basically equates to $2.17 per year per average American. And paying no fossil fuel subsidies would mean that, I think I missed a couple slides here, so I'm just gonna quickly talk about this. So the average price of gas is $1,990 per average American. And so with fossil fuel subsidies, we can see here that the average American at the end of the day, once they incorporate the fossil fuel subsidy as well as the average price of gas per American per year, would equate to roughly $4,500. When we take out the subsidy, that $1,990 or 91 goes up by $2.17. So we see that in this, without subsidies, the average American would pay less for gas than they do now. In addition, the International Monetary Fund calculated that there would be 5 trillion environmental cleanup and healthcare costs from burning fossil fuels. And we encourage everyone to vote for climate in that post as well. We also tackle some posts in terms of voter guides. And so this was an effort back in November and also still applicable, as you just heard from Hayley. So we featured Senator David Perdue, who's one of 4 candidates up for the special election race on January 5th, I want to say. And unfortunately, Senator Perdue has accepted a lot of money from big oil and big gas. So we are endorsing candidate John Ossoff. If you live in Georgia, have friends in Georgia, or have a deep connection to Georgia, we encourage you to get on the phones and phone bank and or push out some of these some of the social media to really get that activated. Kind of back to our whole idea is that with Vote for Climate, we want people to also vote for collective community. And what that means for us is that when we think about other people while we are voting or taking up action, we're probably doing creating a better impact and a more meaningful impact for our local community. Instead of just being self-centered, we are community-centered. that is our goal with Vote for Climate, is that we want to create a world, a community where climate justice and the climate justice is a key element, and the climate crisis moves down from a crisis to something that we have tackled, right? So kind of in just what we have learned in Vote for Climate and in the social campaign is, well, like, how many people are actually listening to us, right? So we aren't one specific account. We are, a hashtag that's flowing. So we're actually leveraging everyone's networks that's a volunteer in Vote for Climate. And what that means is that on average, we have maybe like 20 interactions per post, but they're all in different locations around the nation. And we have a few people in Asia and Europe. So it's getting around in that sense. On LinkedIn, it gets at least like 500 views. I've written 2 Medium posts. One gets, 37 read ratio and the other is 88%, which for me, that's a really big deal because I don't write at all. So we are getting some traction, but we definitely need to get more, and we realize that. And that's something that we're working for the New Year's, is how to really elevate what we're doing and make sure that other people know and can, this gets out because it is accessible. And we've heard a lot of people saying that it's, wow, like, you're really breaking this down, and now I understand what you're talking about. So kind of like a question that we want you to dwell on, or at least like take it from here, is what are other ways that as, climate designers, activists, or creatives, or however you identify yourself in this call, how can we interface with and incorporate policy into our work? I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Suhaila. That was great. Some good questions, and I think we will open it up to a Q&A in just a second. But before we do that, Hayley, taking a look at some of the things that we've put out there, I would love to get your thoughts. I feel like what we're doing as designers, as creatives, as I just call us civilians, we're just, people that aren't inside government at all. We take things that have been taken from, I guess, the PR people that work for the government, or whatever, however it gets to the journalists who then publish it in things like the New York Times. And then we take that and try to translate it. And there's just, a lot of points in that game of telephone. And so for Hayley, as someone who works on the inside of that, like eliminating the middlemen, I'd love to hear what you think of these kinds of things that we've started doing. And is there any way that we could do better or make them more effective in your opinion? And then I'd like to open that up to the whole group.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think so. One, in terms of what Suhaila just shared as the product, I think that those are excellent, and probably a number of you on this call can speak to this with more training and authority than I can. But just as a person who consumes information, I think what those sorts of graphics and information campaigns do incredibly well, and they serve an important function, which is taking these complicated issues that the average person probably does not expend very much time thinking about into something that is bite-sized, can be read quickly, and can be digested quickly. I'm speaking even as someone who's spent most of the last 14 years working on these issues and trying to understand the nuances of climate science can be mind-numbing. Like, it's really confusing. I would say, for example, climate deniers or climate skeptics have used the fact that the science can sometimes be misleading to their advantage by saying things like, well, the science isn't settled, so we can't act on X, Y, Z. So things being complicated can actually serve to hurt the cause. So I think, one, I would say these types of information campaigns are really important, and doing the exact types of things you're doing around like things that are happening, like important elections that have an impact, highlighting the environmental record of one candidate versus another. That's the nonprofit League of Conservation Voters that I used to work for does this. They produce something called the Dirty Dozen every year, where they highlight the 12 worst members of Congress who are up for re-election, and then they highlight people who are good instead. In terms of the second part of your question, Sarah, around either what could be done better, I think it was kind of around how to get information. I think that this is an important question that I don't have an easy answer to, and I think maybe it feeds into our brainstorming, which is that there are disconnects and silos between some of these worlds. So when I worked at the State Department in Washington, D.C., it felt like its own world. It was a big world, but it was a big world populated by other policy analysts and negotiators and people who were really deeply into the weeds on the issues. And while there are people in federal government, and I assume in state and local too, whose job is something like public affairs, public communications, at State Department, it was called public diplomacy. In my opinion, government doesn't do a great job of making things really accessible. And I think that's where activists can come in. To the question of like other like information sources that are good. I mean, I have certain news sources that I think are quite good. There's a site called E&E News, which focuses on energy and environment. They kind of talk about less just the headlines, but they go into more detail. There's also nonprofits nonprofits or think tanks who do a good job of synthesizing information. And those are people I still look to when there's a big UN climate report that comes out that's literally 800 pages long. And I'm like, what do I actually need to know about this? But yeah, I think I think it's something to keep talking about too, though, around how do we bridge some of the divides?
Nice, thank you. And I don't know if you can speak to the accuracy of some of the things that Suhaila shared, when we're getting things from mass media. We always worry about whether we're sharing the most accurate. We want to be accurate. We want to be factual. But it's hard when we don't have access to information from the source. Like I said, that telephone game, things could be spun. Do you have any opinion on that, or do you think journalists are doing an okay job, or do you have anything to say on that?
I think depending on what information you're putting out, published journalism can be a really good source. And, I find the New York Times to be a really unimpeachable source in terms of the quality of their journalism. If I see something that's in the New York Times, for example, or the BBC, just as two examples, like I feel pretty confident that that's accurate. I do think if you're publishing, statistics, a lot of times the news source should link that to something. So to do extra due diligence, when they say emissions are the highest they've been since X year and it's linked, click on it and see where they're getting it from. I'd also say that some of this information, a lot of it is publicly available. Like I was even checking some stats before this presentation today on, I wanted to confirm, is 2020 the hottest year on record? Actually, it is the second hottest year on record, and 2016 is the hottest. My information came from, I think it was NASA's website. So a lot of this, NASA, NOAA, which is another government agency, they do a really good job of publishing their findings. And even though they have been under attack under the Trump administration in terms of some of the, censoring of materials, they are publishing their research. So that's like my process. Like I tend to, if I want to put a stat out and not sound like an idiot, if it's wrong, I'll Google it and just see what search results come up. There's probably a better way, but that's what works for me as sort of like a private citizen.
Yeah, that's kind of how we've been doing it as well. So it feels a little bit validating to hear that you do the same thing. On this topic, Maren had a good question about if you could name some of the nonprofits you think are having the most impact, or my question to add on to that would be some of the ones that you think are the most interesting for news to follow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think like any world that you look in, there's a number of different players. So I think there's actually a huge number of environmental organizations, and they kind of span from deeply activist organizations that you might label as more progressive, or some people will call more radical. Like I'd put like Greenpeace there. Then there's some that more focus on research and putting information out. Like there's like a big spectrum, but ones that I think are very good or I follow. For information, the World Resources Institute, or WRI, is very good. They have a lot of scientists on staff, and they publish, like they're one of the ones who publish facts and figures on emissions trends and, you know, industry standards. That's very good. Environmental Defense Fund is good. They have more of a law focus. Like they have a lot of lawyers on their staff. I think that they're some of the ones, oh no, it's the NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. They do a lot of suing of the Trump administration and others when the administration does questionably legal things. Like they have lawyers that will come in and try to like stop, you know, public lands from being opened up. I really like, in terms of if you're interested in activism and campaigns, 350.org is a great organization. It was started by Bill McKibben, who's a big like a very famous climate activist out of Middlebury College in Vermont. I used to do some work with them and have a couple of good friends who run policy there. But I think they're a nice mix of, they're definitely on more of the progressive side, and they push hard, but they run really good campaigns, both sort of like gathering people in non-pandemic times, and also I would say like eye-catching campaigns. So I think that they're someone good to go to for inspiration. And then the last I would say, in terms of the work that you guys have been doing around voter education and awareness, I do think the League of Conservation Voters, where I used to work, does a good job on this. They don't have as much name recognition because they sort of are in DC and mostly work kind of in the system with members of Congress, but they also have a really large grassroots base. Like they're a membership organization, so people pay in and they have state leagues. But I feel that they have very good information on, like I think they still do this. They produce a report card. I think it's every 2 years, and every single member of Congress gets a grade in terms of how they do on the environment. And when you work there as a junior staffer, you are lucky or unlucky enough to sit there and tally the points that they get for the different legislation they're being scored on. But honestly, I think that is such a good resource, a good like transparency resource for people.
Awesome, thank you. I have so many questions for you, and I'm trying to figure out the best order to ask them in, so that we're kind of, I don't know, I want there to be like a flow to the conversation. I guess since you were talking about, let's see, well, let's just, you know, complete Marin's question, since I asked half of it. This is a more higher level question from Marin. She says, at a high level, do you think Washington groks the urgency of the climate crisis?
What does groks mean?
Understand at a very like thorough level. Like, do they get it? Yeah,
well, one thing that's interesting here, and I don't mean this just to pick, go pick apart the words in the question, but there's a like, what does Washington mean? Like, are we talking about basically Washington as the government, the establishment type of thing?
And Marin, feel free to come on and chip in.
Yeah, because one thing, and I know that we've talked about this in some of our brainstorming conversations internally, is one thing, like there's significant difference between, say, the federal government or the executive branch, the White House, but then its cabinet agencies and Congress, both of which are part of Washington. And at various times, in the past, under the past 4 years, Congress was actually potentially where more action was going to get done, whereas under the Obama administration, there was more power to be had in the executive branch to get things done. But in terms of, if we're thinking about it, like, does government writ large understand the urgency of the climate crisis? the people who work directly on climate change, I would say yes. I'm drawing a distinction between Trump political appointees, of which there were literally zero at the State Department. So we didn't have any sort of oversight in that way. But from friends I have who work at the EPA, they they had two different administrators who had strong ties to the fossil fuel industry, and a number of the other appointees did as well. So you have like political appointees from Trump, I think they're like a different category on this. But yeah, I think there is awareness of the urgency of the climate crisis in Washington, but the $1 million question is what gets done about it. I think I can remember back to in 2008 when I was starting my first job. It was a couple months before Obama was first elected, and climate and environmental activists were thrilled, including the organization I was at. And then they quickly became very upset because at the beginning of 2009, the thing that Obama put his political capital behind was working toward universal health care. And that makes total sense. But the climate community was really unhappy because a lot of people felt like they'd put a ton of money and resources and rallied people, and then the opportunity was missed. And one lesson from that I took from that I think is really important is that everyone has, in Biden, like his people, they're coming in with a lot of political capital, but it's finite. So there's going to be this question of where do you focus your attention, because you lose it when you have to push people to do something they don't want to do. You then lose the ability to keep pushing them on other things. One thing that I'll just maybe add on that I think is really promising is on Biden's transition website, he's got 4 issues that are basically the most important issues facing the country. And these are things like dealing with the COVID pandemic and economic recovery from, the country being decimated. And another of those priorities is climate change. And the 4th is racial equity. I think, to me, that's honestly huge. He's said this, but he's really signaling that climate is at the top of my list. The fact that he's mainstreaming climate into most federal agencies, this hasn't really happened before. Like it used to be, this is kind of how it was at the State Department. The State Department is a lot of, at least in the past, distinguished middle-aged white men who work for government. And then there was the kind of like crunchy climate office that didn't really fit the mold. But now climate isn't being segmented in that way. It's the Treasury Department needs to care about climate change because climate risk is an issue, and we're incorporating it at USDA and also in defense because climate security is an issue. So I think, to me, doing that gives us a much better chance of actually getting things done on climate, because while it's great that there are more and more climate activists, at least what has happened in the past is that when it comes down to an economic recession or a health crisis or working on climate change tends to be the issue that gets dropped because it doesn't feel as existential. And it's maybe still slower than we'd want it to be, but I really see that climate is more center stage, even amongst non-climate activists in government, than it ever has been.
Yeah, that is really encouraging and really exciting. So many questions to go from there. I'm going to go over to Shokai's question for Suhaila now, just to give Hayley a little chance to get a drink of water. So Shokai asks Suhaila, a really good question. I've recently been researching climate justice frameworks to incorporate in my design sprints, and one term that I found hard to wrap my brain around, translocal organizing. How do you connect the dots between issues facing different communities and exchange knowledge and strategy without getting overwhelmed and off focus, which is very similar to some of the conversations that Suhaila and I have had. So I wonder this as well, and I'm curious what other people have to say about this as well.
Hi, thanks, Shokai, for your question. I do want to say I 100% Googled translocal organizing when you posted that question. So this is a very new term for me. And so I hope I'm answering it as, let me know if I answer your question, is basically what I'm saying. So I'm going to quickly start off with, I'm going to go a few different directions here. So in terms of Vote for Climate, we came into it and we built it with, with the help of Sarah and Brennan and Catriel and everyone else here on the call. I think Rachel was here too. We built it in a way where it's kind of like open source. So we're trusting the volunteer network that we have here to not only like find the information and create the information and storytell it, and but also to share it. And we encourage everyone to share our content. And we have like sample captions and like who to credit. And then we have all our sources on the website that Sarah had shared earlier. So even on that website, we're like, hey, download this image, go share it wherever you need to share it. Like, like it's meant to be open so that we can get the conversation going. Like we want to own what we're doing in terms of crediting everyone involved to make that happen. But like, let me know if I'm, speaking too out of the box here, Catriel, Sarah, and Brennan, but we want you to steal our stuff. It's basically the mindset that we had going into this network. Kind of getting a little bit more into what you were talking about like connecting with different issues around the community. And I'm gonna step back a second. Apart from Vote for Climate, I'm also a climate reality leader. So I went through the training. It's like an Al Gore training, and I went through it in July. And there's several chapters globally. So I'm involved now with a local chapter in the Bay Area. And what I've learned from that is like I'm somehow a part of this like subcommittee working on climate justice and climate justice policy. And what we kind of decided in that is, well, the first principle of environmental justice or climate justice is don't start afresh, like build off of what everyone else has done, because as like we're in this together is basically the thought process. And that's like kind of the Jemez principles, if you've heard about them, and back in 1991 or 1992 that they were produced. And so that's the mindset that we took on for that. Okay, like, so we don't want to start afresh. Let's lean into what other people are doing. So right now we're actually researching and looking up local organizations that are working on climate justice and climate justice policy. We're going to get that whole list, and our plan is to literally just go up to them and be like, hey, we're a resource, we have a network, how can we help you? And I think that that's like one of the ways to do that. It is really overwhelming. I don't know how to I don't think there is a way to not be overwhelmed with it, which I'm not trying to overwhelm you more, but I think that there's so much going on, which is really exciting. And I think the overwhelming happens when you're trying, like when you see things that are disconnected, but also when there's just so much that you're interested in that you want to be a part of it all, right? And at least that happens for me. So maybe I'm just speaking about myself. But like it's like you can be part of one organization and also be a part of another and be that bridge, right? Like we can talk about that. Like, okay, like, hey, we're doing this here with Vote for Climate. I'm also doing something with climate justice in, the creative climate reality project. I'm also doing with climate policy with the climate reality project with building electrification and EV charging. I just got involved with that last week. And so like they're all connected, and I'm sharing these resources with everyone and having these conversations. And I think that's, I don't know if this is helping, but like having that as maybe a starting point of let's just have a conversation of everything that we've learned. And that's how Vote for Climate kind of started, is with Sarah and with Eric. It was just like, okay, well, let's talk about this. So I don't know if that really answers your question about connecting the dots. But I hope that gives you a little insight. Feel free to, hit me up too and ask more.
Yeah, what do you think, Shokai? Is that helpful?
It's super helpful. I've just been thinking a lot about recently, like going into kind of going out of a more traditional design role into more community organizing and like trying to be that designer that's helping out with generating solutions and uh, that just I don't want to be remaking a bunch of wheels when there's so many wheels already out there, and then the task of like researching all those wheels becomes a whole kind of full-time project. And I guess I don't know, maybe it's what I'm just thinking about, what is my question, what is my role as a designer in climate, and maybe it's to become less of a designer and more of a listener, like even more of a listener than I already am. So
I love that.
Definitely. Yeah, I hear you there, Shokai. I'm in that work right now. I'm in community engagement. So I kind of backed away from design as a traditional practice. And I think that that's one of the ways that I actually talk about myself besides climate designer, social impact designers. I say that I'm a tool that the community uses to get to whatever solutions or impacts that they want to see. Um, so yeah, I'm definitely happy to continue that conversation, Shokai, as well.
I'd maybe offer, this is Hayley, one thought, and obviously not as a designer, but as a, job haver, interest holder, career seeker always. And just thinking of my career experiences now, but like certainly in the past, when I think back, what has always helped me is kind of like Suhaila was saying, trying things out with new organizations, including like not necessarily taking a full-time job or like committing to a career shift, but even things that I've been able to do on the side, like on a volunteer basis, like you connect with someone on Instagram and you start having a conversation and connect with their group. Because I think when I was very early in my career, I used to more think I have to figure out what my next step is going to be and really what my next 5 steps are going to be before I can take the first step. And in my case, at least, that was sort of a recipe for paralysis, because you just get so nervous about, well, I don't know all the options. What if I take the wrong step? And then what am I going to do? And when I was able to really try to reframe to trying things out, having new experiences, and it's only through having the experience do you see whether, I don't know, I was just looking at their website, so it comes to mind like, oh, the People's Climate March, which was this coalition of a ton of really cool groups that came together as a result of all these climate marches. Maybe it's amazing doing some of their visual organizing or other work. You may actually realize that you loathe it and you want to go in another direction. But at least for myself, I've never really been good at knowing what I like and don't like until I actually try it. So I think, and maybe other people in this community have ideas, but ways you can do like a pro bono project, volunteer, like Suhaila was saying, becoming a climate reality leader. To me, that seems like a great way to sort of like dip your toe into things without necessarily locking yourself in to a path.
Nice. That's my motto as well. Try everything. Do little tiny experiments. And yeah, don't aim for perfection, just try things. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you, Hayley. We've been hearing a lot of noise recently about the appointees that the Biden administration are making. And you mentioned a little bit that the appointees have oversight into different areas, and so they do make a pretty significant difference or impact. And another question of Shokai's actually was, how significant is it that there's the new position being created for John Kerry? I can't remember the title of it, but there's like head of climate something. And just, how significant are these appointees that we're hearing a lot of noise about right now in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is they are and they aren't. They don't dictate everything. It's not, and I would also say any appointee that you have has a massive staff underneath him as one of those former nameless staffers. You know, it takes a lot to sort of feed up to them, but they do make a difference. I mean, the one quick anecdote, part of the reason things were really tough at the State Department under Trump is that there were so many high level positions at the State Department that were left vacant, like they were for political appointees and weren't filled. And basically what that serves to do is like devalue that agency in relation to others, because it feels like, well, none of the president's people are here. We're not going to listen to this group. So one, it is important for an agency who leads them, but they don't dictate everything. To speak more specifically and to the John Kerry position, I actually think that this one is quite significant. This won't be like the be all end all, but for those who weren't following, Biden has announced this newly created position. I believe he's calling it a climate czar, or maybe it was a climate envoy. The difference is it's housed in the White House, basically in the National Security Council. And the reason this is a big deal is because if you have the White House at the center of things and then the different agencies sort of around and feeding in, the thing Obama did that was new is he created a climate envoy at the State Department. And that person reported directly to the Secretary of State and sort of like elevated the issue. But Biden is actually taking that several steps further, and he's taking that person and putting him right in the White House with him. So I think that does a couple things. One, it puts climate change on the same level as other national security issues, which traditionally have been seen as like the bread and butter of economic and security policy. So like now you're going to have Kerry, someone who has the climate portfolio, literally with a seat at the table on these really central conversations about security and economy. So climate won't be an afterthought, it'll actually be at the table. It also mentioned that I think it's pretty telling that the choice is Kerry. One, I think, you know, some skeptics will say, oh, well, look, it's Biden appointing more kind of people who've been in government forever, which is true. But Kerry has a special role because he's actually the person who signed the Paris Agreement for the United States when it was agreed to. He was the Secretary of State then. So a number of my former colleagues worked really closely with John Kerry on the climate negotiations. So and he cares passionately about it. So it very much sends a signal that the US is back in on this. So I think it's going to be a big deal. You also may or may not have seen, it was either yesterday or today, that Biden also just appointed this climate coordinator position at the White House. And this is Gina McCarthy, who was President Obama's EPA administrator. And she's like pretty, maybe not quite activist leaning, but she's definitely liberal leaning on environmental issues. And I guess the last point I'll say on this is a lot of my work at the State Department involved coordinating with the NSC, which is the National Security Council. The shorthand we use was, I need to go talk to the White House on XYZ. Like those people, like Kerry's team, Gina McCarthy's team, they're the ones who are going to be setting the tone for what the different agencies carry out. So I just think it's only a good sign. It's yet again showing that climate is going to be right in Biden's inner circle. Maybe like super briefly on some of the other appointees. I think that's a little bit too soon to say. I know that the EPA administrator hasn't been appointed. For the State Department, Antony Blinken is the Secretary of State, and he's never done, he hasn't worked on climate particularly, but I think all signs point to going in a good direction. But I think the Kerry appointee is particularly interesting because it's going to mean like a shakeup in how the White House is structured.
Fascinating. Absolutely.
If you don't mind, do you mind me jumping on this, Sarah?
Oh, absolutely.
So 100% agree with what Hayley said about the role that John Kerry has, and you know that appointment is not. It doesn't need to be approved by Senate. or Congress, I should say. And so in my opinion, like I respect John Kerry, and like he has this international face of being a climate advocate for the United States. I do think, however, that it was a safe bet, and that because it wasn't an appointment that needed to be approved by Congress, that he could have gone bolder with the appointment and picked someone. And like maybe this is like wrong of me to just say this boldly out loud, so I apologize if I offend anyone here. He picked an old white man to head climate policy, and in his campaign, Biden committed to environmental justice communities. Right, he's going to commit 40% of all environmental funds to go to environmental justice communities, and so picking someone for this new position that is an old white man just seems like a safe bet. Whereas I think that it's great that we do have this position. I think that it could have been pushed further, and to maybe get a grassroots leader, someone from the Indigenous community, from the Black community, from the Latinx community, and really push boundaries and get that leadership, and really someone who would advocate for these communities because they've lived in them. And in terms of Gina McCarthy, I was just looking that up too. She's the NRDC. She used to be NRDC, I think, too, right, Hayley? Yeah, so that's exciting as well. Sorry, had to plug that in.
Love it. Love it. I want to circle back to something, Hayley, you said early on about, Biden's ambitious climate plan and the whole phrase, if enacted. You talked about Congress, who controls the Senate being a potential roadblock to those plans being enacted. Are there any other significant potential roadblocks that you can foresee that we should be aware of, that we can help alleviate? Designers are problem solvers. So is there anything that you can foresee that we could help become less of a problem before it becomes a problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So yeah, definitely follow the Georgia Senate races if this is something you care about and you're able to virtually volunteer, or people in Georgia who ask if they're registered to vote, et cetera, et cetera. That's like a really kind of important pivotal one. I think for other roadblocks, it's going to be tough to say. Like one thing I would say is definitely we should all pay attention to what Biden starts doing come January 1st, which is his first full day in office. Like I was saying, he's almost certain to announce that the US is re-entering the Paris Agreement on that day. He might even start officially undoing some of these environmental rollbacks, like the most important ones. But Congress could perpetually be a roadblock. And honestly, even with a Democrat-controlled Senate, again, it's like the devil's in the details. To get sort of money allocated, a lot of times that has to come from Congress. So I think kind of like an ongoing area to watch that could be important, for example, could be different congressional measures being debated. Will money be given? How much money will be given? Like that's an area to watch, and maybe do some brainstorming around what sort of campaigns, like grassroots campaigns, can be used to put pressure on members of Congress. Another one, and I know that your Vote for Climate work is already doing some around this, but which is the rollbacks question. So what's likely to happen is the EPA and the Department of Interior are going to want to undo all of the rollbacks that the Trump administration just did, which is why sometimes working for government feels like, I don't know, knitting something and then undoing it and then knitting it again. But so there's going to be an effort to get back to where things were, but actually things have to go further domestically in order to actually hit the goals of the Paris Agreement, and in particular, try to not go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So it's basically undo what Trump did and then some. So I think that focusing on EPA and Department of Interior, if you care about public lands issues, would be great areas to watch. I don't have a ton of really clear, specific ideas since this hasn't been my area of focus. But for example, I know that EPA has public comment periods that are congressionally mandated when different measures are being discussed, and they are like congressionally obligated to hold them and to respond. So when I worked at the League of Conservation Voters, sometimes we would organize amongst LCV members letter writing campaigns, so that you hand over a huge stack of papers that the agency has to review and respond to. I'm trying to see if I can think of anything else. And the other thing will be, it's that point of political capital. Like Biden or any president, like literally cannot do everything at once as a top priority. Like he'll have to prioritize, but that doesn't mean that we will all agree with how he decides to prioritize things. And I think the risk always with any president, it was the same with Obama, is you put forward a plan, the plan sounds great, the plan sounds ambitious, but it doesn't mean anything until it actually gets put into effect. And that's where the actual rules matter. So I think we should all be following what is getting announced. Like once we have these climate folks in place, what are they saying is going to happen when? And do we agree with that? Do we think that they are putting the focus correctly? Does it seem like they're actually backsliding a bit on something that they promised? And basically, like elected officials are really, really sensitive to public campaigns, and social media has only amplified that. With relatively little effort, you can get a viral Instagram campaign that makes the news, and that can actually sway people.
Yeah, that was going to be my final question, and we are at about the end here. So I apologize. I know Brennan had a good question I didn't quite get to, and if anyone else had other questions that we didn't quite get to, I'm super sorry about that, but feel free to carry on the conversation in the online community.
I'll also say, if anyone has a question for me specifically, I'm happy to drop my email into the chat if you want to shoot me a message after.
Awesome. Thank you for making yourself available that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of how sensitive politicians and government leaders and legislators are to, demands of activists and civilians, and like what is the most effective and impactful way that we can, in your opinion, I don't know if you have all of the answers on this, but just as somebody who worked on the inside, are these social media campaigns effective? Or is it letter writing, or is it calling the senator directly, calling your representatives, or is there something else that's even more effective, or do you know?
I will give my thoughts, but do want to caveat that this isn't something that has been a core part of my work. So I'm kind of going off of just kind of what makes sense to me. And also, way back in the day, I worked as a little congressional intern when I was in college. So I got to read the often crazy letters from constituents that came through. But no, I think I feel like what has impact and carries up, certainly like where I worked at state, it was a lot of times like what made the news. Like if something made the news, it was like, oh, now we have to respond to this. So if something becomes a news story, I do know that I think this is more the case in Congress, because Congress is a different animal, because especially in the House, you're literally always thinking about your reelection. Like members of Congress are up for election every 2 years. It, like, as soon as you're elected, you're starting to plan your next election and fundraising, which is a whole question about like whole other matter of like money and politics and the issue there. But they are extremely sensitive to what their constituents think. So I think for things that are congressionally related, like if it's legislation that's up about will Congress give money to fund clean energy jobs training or something like that, that's something where letter writing, like anything that gets through to a congressional office, is important, because those people have to think about what are my voters thinking about? I would say this is a huge generalization, but for more like federal government, I do think it's maybe more what gets in the news, because you just feel somewhat more insulated because there are just so many levels up that you are. But the last thing I would say though is just that numbers always matter. And one thing that is so great with social media is that you can build numbers quickly, and especially in the reality we're living in right now, where it's really hard to get together in person. The fact that you can use different media platforms to organize virtually, I think is huge. The last little example of that I'll give was the climate march, and then even step outside climate to the Women's March back in January after Trump was elected. Like that is impossible to ignore. And granted, those are big things, and obviously the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening so often this year, like that sends an unignorable signal. But a lot of times the way stuff like that starts is through organizing, including through some of the grassroots groups that I've named and that Suhaila has named. So it really can all feed up, which is why I think getting started with the grassroots causes that matter to you will keep you informed, and you'll be dipping your toe in work that really matters.
Yeah, just to quickly, I know we're almost out of time, but to quickly add on to that, is to just be vocal. As Hayley said, currently, before this last election, only 21% of environmentalists voted in the U.S., and that's thanks, Sarah, for researching that. So, like, be vocal, demand things from your local representative, be in contact with them, attend their town halls, even with your county, with your local council, and get the conversations going, because that's how we're going to see the representation of older environmental advocates in elected office.
Amazing. That does give us some good ideas and goals to shoot for. Let's get in the news, y'all. What can we do to get in the news? Okay, so I will wrap this up because it is past the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Hayley and Suhaila, for your time and for showing up and answering questions and giving so much amazing information. This has been fantastic. And thank you to everybody who spent this 90 minutes with us and asked great questions and was part of the discussion. And hopefully we gave you some really cool ideas and new thoughts and new information. And yeah, real quick before everybody jumps off, I want to let you know we're having another amazing event on Friday. We talked about 350.org. We're big fans. One of the old school, he was a leader of the climate, wait, I just had it. He was a leader of their digital campaigns manager, Duncan Meisel. He is now working for Fossil Free Media, I believe, and his newest campaign is Clean Creatives. So that's Friday. We're going to talk about what the Clean Creatives campaign is all about, is saying no to fossil fuel clients as an ad or PR agency or employee or creative. So super on point and on topic, and we're really excited to get some more information and knowledge and have a debate, discussion, brainstorm with him on Friday. So yes, that is it. Thank you so much, Hayley and Suhaila, and everybody for being here today.
And quick note, I put the link to the event on Friday in the chat, so you all can RSVP. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
guys.
everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Take care.